start with this session. So welcome here, as I say, is welcome to the CEPS Recovery and Resilience Monitor. You can find also the project online as in a website. I will show it to you in a second. Very easy to find. It's called RRFmonitor and /CEPS. So if you put RRFmonitor CEPS, you'll find it. So what is this about, and why do we have how we get to get Damian to join us also, and what we're going to do today is quite interesting. So first of all, the RRF monitor is what we do. We monitor the RRF. We hope we'll continue to do so in the future. It is about the plans, what's going on, the implementation, and afterwards monitoring, checking how it's going. The Recovery and Resilience Facility is a very particular instrument. It's quite different than the usual instruments the EU has used until now, and quite a lot of things are open for question. Now, what we are looking today is about two parts. We in the project, we are looking at more about the financial, fiscal, and the reforms, sustainability, let's say how good they are, and how financially and economically this is going to move forward. We have Damian, who has a very interesting work that he has been looking from his side. The work there is very much focused on the quality, on the sustainability, from the point of view more about the climate part of it, environmental. But there is also in his work quite a consideration on the overall sustainability of the programs. So we think that it's very interesting because we look from different sides and meet somewhere in the middle. It is both are very important. We cannot, from our side, we decided to focus specifically on reforms and the economic part of it, because it's important. It's just a focusing. We look at that because also not so very often not so much spoken about it. But of course, it's the overall that matters. So this is why I think this session is interesting, because it gives this vision from the sides. Our idea in the project was not to do an analysis, the typical analysis, to see if the countries fulfill the requirements of the Commission and the country-specific recommendation. I want to go a bit deeper. What are the actual problems that they are describing? What do we see in these countries? And try to think, are they good as strategies? Not are they fulfilling well the requirements? These are slightly different things. Having a good mark as a strategy to get the funding is not exactly the same as having a good strategy for practical things. So very quickly now, just to give you an idea, if you want to know more about what we are doing from the point of view of the recovery on this website, here is the website. Here is the original moderator that had to, it's actually not well today. I used a photograph of the dog. Some of you found it on Twitter and LinkedIn just to attract attention. It was a very funny situation in a real webinar I was on, that I had this dog borrowed. I mean, had to take care for some time. Put the dog on my lap and was very seriously looking at the screen. So there we are. So this is the website. Here you have and inside what you see in the website is, for example, some data about the progress of the RRF, the publications, and our assessment. The Commission assessment is also there on this website. And then we have the CEPS assessments for several countries. We've done six until now, the biggest one. And this is Spain, Portugal, Italy, France, Germany, and we have taken Slovakia and Central and Eastern Europe, but we are doing other ones. So this is just to say this is what we do now. And then we have this. What we are discussing today is one of the publications that you find here. But now let's go forward. What we'll do now is to give you a very short description of the economic side, the analysis that we have, and then we will ask Damian to show all of the work he's doing and his opinion and what he sees in all of this. Of course, I think you're more interested in listening to him, I suppose. So that's why we start, so that we don't lose afterwards. Nobody's interested anymore. But we are going to give you just a small wrap up, and then I hope we have time to discuss further. So Francesco, I would like to ask you just to give an overview. Francesco is researcher in CEPS, working with me. He's also an adjunct professor in the University of Milan, and he's working with this very intensively. So the floor is yours, Francesco.
Yeah. Many thanks, Jorge. I'm gonna quickly share my screen. Just confirm it. You should be able to see it now. Just give me a confirmation that is a full screen. Okay, great.
Yes.
I'm gonna briefly introduce you what's the main elements that we're looking at when we compare and try to assess the plans. And I think it's pretty much useful to start from these pictures, which is the evaluation of the Commission of the plans, which apparently is pretty good. Let's say that our starting point is, are the plans so good to deserve an A mark in all the aspects that the Commission is looking at? And that's why basically we develop our in-house approach, trying to develop a methodology to assess plans that are difficult to access and difficult to compare. And what we look at, as Jorge said, is the economic and social relevance of the reforms and investments included in the plan. And with respect to reforms, we look at three aspects that actually also the Commission look at, but in a different way. So when we look at the relevance of the reforms, so the extent to which a reform is actually addressing the structural problems of a country, what we try to do is to go a little bit beyond the content of the CSRs, which is pretty narrow. And so we try to expand a little bit the analysis by looking at not only the country reports, but also at other international organization assessment of the plans in different policy areas you can see in the publication. So we focus obviously on labor market, product market, justice, public administration, and social policy, as well as taxation. When we look at the effectiveness, we try to understand to what extent the reforms that are included in the plan are credible. And in this respect, with credibility, we mean whether the reforms have a long-lasting impact and whether the plan put in place actually an effective and convincing monitoring tool to monitor exactly the implementation of the plan. So we look at the timeline, credibility, and then the milestones. And finally, what is very important for us is to look at the coherence, both internal coherence, so whether there is actually a mutual reinforcement effect between the reforms and there are not contradictions, and whether there is external coherence with investments. And when it comes to investments, the approach is pretty easy. It's follow the money. So what we are interested in is not about the levels. We are not looking at how green are the plans and how digital are the plans, but what we are interested is in looking exactly at the economic sector that will be invested by the plan. So what are the economic sectors that are involved in the investment project proposed? And the very key interest of our project is to assess the additionality in terms of public investments by looking at whether the projects that are proposed in the recovery plans are actually new or not. So I'm just gonna show you a very quick comparison between Italy and Germany that are two opposite case studies, let's say. And in this picture, in this graph, what you can see is that is the distribution and the timeline for reforms completion and investments projects completion. And what is pretty blatant is the fact that Italy, so this is the first finding, Italy is front-loading all the reforms, while the completion of the investment project will come later in the years. By contrary, Germany will anticipate all the reforms and anticipate all investments. And what is interesting to observe, especially when it comes to investment, that for instance, Germany has included in its plan investments that are already planned for 2020 and 2021. And if you look at the actual projection of spending under the RRF, it's pretty telling the fact that by 2021, so by this year, Germany will have spent already 50% of the RRF money, which is telling a lot about the additionality of the investments included in the German plan. While by contrast, to reach the 50% of the spending under the RRF, Italy will take time until at least 2023. If we look at the reforms, one of the interesting findings that we do observe, which is also related to the structural challenges of the country, is that we identify two main approaches. We have a structural approach, for instance, the one of Italy, that intervenes basically in all the policy area, except for taxation, that we are looking at, from labor market to justice, public administration, product market. And by contrast, a more sectorial approach of Germany, which do not, for instance, match all the CSR's recommendation, but just focus on some specific group of reforms that are more sectorial than structural. If we look at investment, these two pie cake are pretty telling. It looks like if we base on the 6 RRF pillars of the Commission, that the two plans are very comparable and very similar. So both of the countries invest more or less 40% in the green transition and 20% in the digital transformation. And in this sense, we can say, okay, the plans are pretty similar. But then what we are interested in and what you can find in our comparative reports is actually, okay, what is Italy investing in, for instance, when it comes to the green transition and the green mobility, and what Germany is investing in. So where are the money going? And there you can see that the strategies are pretty much different, because Italy is going to invest more, the largest investment of Italy are in high-speed rail, so in public transport and especially railway transportation, while by contrast, Germany, under the level of the green transition and sustainable mobility, we have the tax incentives for a household to buy electric cars. So it's basically supporting households to buy electric cars. So you can see that the two plans are not exactly comparable when it comes to strategic investments. And then a couple of last slides on the issue of additionality, which for us is very important. What you can see from this figure is that on the horizontal axis, we just put the RRF grants as percent of GDP, while on the vertical axis, we have the so-called surprise effect of the RRF on public investment. Basically, we took the forecast on gross fixed capital formation in 2021 compared to 2019, and what we see, in order to capture a little bit whether the RRF had an effect on, let's say, boosting public investment or not. And what's interesting in this picture is that there is not a significant relation between the public investment and the amount of RRF grants in percent of GDP. And if we dig a little bit into details, what we see is that actually not all the countries follow the Commission's suggestion to invest in new public investment, so to invest in new projects. And while Italy, on the one hand, will dedicate more or less 70% of its investment projects in new projects, in new actions, Germany, by contrast, will largely invest all the money under RRF for already previously budgeted project. And these are it's telling very much about two different strategies to use the RRF, additionality versus, if you wish, fiscal consolidation. So to conclude, national recovery and resilience plans really pursue different strategies. And if we dig a little bit into the plans, we can actually see that when it comes to investments, for instance, there are member states like Germany that will use all this money, most of the money, to let's say, pay for projects that were already budgeted or already in the pipeline, while Italy, for instance, use this money to do actual additional public investments. The other issue is that on reforms, we have different approaches. We have a more structured approach by those member states. Italy is an example that maybe are more in need of structural reforms, but also, on the other hand, we have more sectorial approaches in the reforms that are included in the plan. In terms of additionality, the assumption behind, let's say, the RRF Commission approach is not always holding true. So not always member states, what we observe in our case studies, do use the money for new investments. In many cases, they're covering investments that were already planned. The other finding is that the implementation speed changing significantly between countries. Italy will first front load reforms, which might be explained with different factors, difficulty in absorbing EU funding, etc. While other member states will use the money, will front load both the investments and the reforms. So the opening challenging now is about monitoring. So monitoring will be actually key to keep track of what member states will do, both in terms of the reforms, and there is where I think we should focus a lot of our attention, and also in terms of investments. And in this respect, it will be obviously key the involvement of relevant stakeholders at national level to monitor the actual implementation of the reforms and the plans. So this is a little bit of a very quick overview of some key elements that you can find in the reports, and I leave the floor to Jorge and Damian.
Yes. Thank you. Now, this was, it's a bit of fast overview that has been presented. It's you have the set. The document is online. What we tried to do is that the assessment. We have the assessments of each country. You can find. The objective is to make them very short, so as short as possible, because the assessments of the commissions are very long. We try to make sure that when you read it, you have a picture of each country and that you can compare them. We use the same kind of structure, the same kind of approach to facilitate it. This was a tough job. You have to imagine that Spain has 1,500 pages, of which you have the main strategy and 30-something annex strategies. And other countries have just the main strategy. And not to forget, when reading it, that you have to be aware that some countries have an enormous national recovery, like France, 100 billion already, and this is additional, like extending it. So it's very, very difficult to compare them, and we will continue working on that. But you can have this this view. On questions and answers, you have in the chat there, you have the ability to go to questions and answers. I didn't say this at the beginning. It's on the bottom on the right. You have Q&A. You can ask questions there that we will handle at the questions and answers session. We will be going through them and answer what I will just pick. I hope there are not too many and that we can answer all of them. But now I would like to ask Damian to present his work. Thank you for joining us. I know you're very busy, so you're jumping from sessions to just come to this one. So I'm very pleased that you're there, that you managed, because I know that it's not easy at all. So thank you for being here, and welcome to this session. So
thank you.
I leave the floor to you. You explain what you are doing and your work. That is very interesting.
I'll be happy to. Thank you, Jorge, and also thank you, Francesco, for the very succinct insights. One of these, like some of these slides, I would instantly tweet, and give my comments to. But I'll come to one of your, some of your points in a second. First of all, maybe it makes sense that I quickly introduce myself, and then I'll lead you in a very fast-track procedure of how this law came about, and then answer to the actual question that you're asking, which is what are we currently doing? But I think it builds very much on what we have been doing. So I'll just bear with me for 1 second for a bit of background. So basically, maybe just to very quickly explain, I'm basically a member of a very young movement called Volt, and the idea of Volt is that we need a European party and we can't just think nationally. I think in this context, obviously, this is especially important to understand that obviously I'm very much for common approaches to the issues that we see across Europe or the challenges that we face together. And so I think this is also the case here. So when I joined basically the Greens group, I also entered the budget committee, and in the budget committee, I focused very much only on instruments that have something to do with basically our monetary union and our fiscal union, because I was, by training also at least to a part an economist, and I've always thought very hard about the fact that the ECB is saying look, if we have crises, you can't just leave us alone and we push down, or we push money into the markets, but we also need not only monetary response, but also fiscal expansion in times of crisis. And for me in 2008, that was especially true. And then in 2011, mean, all these years of the financial crisis with Greece, where I think Europe tried to focus on internal devaluation to make Greece competitive again, which was a very hard austerity policy and had very stark political effects. Without saying that it was completely wrong, I would say what was definitely missing was also at that time already some form of fiscal stimulus package to at least counter some of the effects that we saw back there. So this is basically the background with which I entered the budget committee, and then I focused on an instrument which was supposed to do exactly that. It was Macron's Eurozone budget, or in technical terms, the budgetary instrument for competitiveness and convergence. And everybody basically said this file is dead. You know, the 25 billion that should be distributed by this, it's never going to happen. And then the Corona came, and another situation where we really saw now not so much a structural imbalance, but actually like a huge economic shock, obviously also like a healthcare shock and a social shock, but also an economic shock across the union, which somehow needed some form of a response. And the response, and here we come to the imbalances again, was also needed because some countries can obviously easily get out, or not easily, but more easily get out and start, you know, borrowing funds at the markets and invest. And some others with less fiscal space would have had a much harder time to do the same. So it would have increased the differences and divergences of the different European economies, and therefore it was, I think, also clear that something needed to be done. And so my assistant Johannes and myself, we started writing a lot of amendments to this budgetary instrument to say, like, look, this could actually be the basis for a recovery tool if we use it correctly. I think 3 weeks after we submitted our amendments, the Commission actually replaced that tool by the core of the Recovery Fund, which is the Recovery and Resilience Facility, the one that we're currently talking about. And then I was suddenly part of the negotiations of the biggest EU instrument ever, which is quite funny for the fact that I'm just the only representative of my small movement in this, but that's another story. And then what did we focus on in the negotiations? I mean, for me, as having this European perspective, it was important that once we have, in a way, European taxpayers' money that we are spending, we also need to think about European priorities. And so the first thing that we pushed for in the European Parliament position and also got in was to actually establish that we need European priorities and not only national ones on how to spend this money. And this luckily made it also in the final draft. And from then onwards, I think the discussions were with, okay, what kind of priorities are there and how can we actually make sure that the money is actually spent in this way? And then we negotiate very hard for the 37%. I mean, we wanted 40% to be spent on digital, but we got 37%, and how this would be spent. And this is quite technical. We actually wrote an annex and proposed this to the Commission and the Council to update the spending methodology for green spending. And I'll come back to that in a second. The second point that we fought for was to actually have a 20% digital spending in there, which I won't focus so much on today. And the third one that we didn't get was to have an EU container of money, because the money was supposed to be instantly distributed to the different member states so that everybody could calculate how much they get as a transfer in their national budgets. But for us, it would have made sense to actually, retain some of these funds and invest them in actual European projects. That could be European rail projects. It could also be semiconductor, focus investments or whatever kind of future investments that the EU could agree on. But sadly, this did not happen. I mean, and the last thing, and that is extremely important, is that we as Parliament as a whole fought very hard to have a vote on the national recovery and resilience plans. And here we come a bit to the setup of the EU, but this is not a normal disbursement of funds that we see here. This is a huge amount of money that is spent according to some priorities as set out in national recovery and resilience plans. And we thought that, as a Parliament, our, if you want, royal right, I don't know what the right translation is to be able to vote on how European money is spent. And for us, therefore, it was quite important to get this vote, which in the end we did not get, because all member states and the Commission did not want Parliament to actually mingle in the national recovery and resilience plans. Then we asked to actually have at least some time to review the evaluated or pre-evaluated plans, that the Commission basically looks at the plans and then lets us know what they think, and then we have some time to comment, and then there would be approval. But also this we didn't get, and so what happened then is when the negotiations were closed, and that was just before Christmas last year, the countries prepared and had already started to prepare their national recovery and resilience plans, and then they were handed in, many of them around, I think, around June, 30th of June, and then the Commission, I think, end of May, I think, and then the Commission end of July had the first plans already approved. And in that time, when after the official submission and the approval, we basically from Parliament didn't get any additional information in the beginning from the Commission, had to do the analysis of the plans ourselves to be able to scrutinize the work of the Commission. So I think that is a bit of a suboptimal situation, because as a Parliament, you're not supposed to read, and you said it, Francesco, as well, 27 times, I don't know, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 pages of plans written in a national language. This is not what parliamentarians are used to normally do. This is something that an executive should do and create transparency about, and then parliamentarians are supposed to scrutinize. But we were a bit of a pickle, because either we would have let this pass, or we would have, basically tried to analyze it. And so we decided that we would go for the second way and actually analyze as much as we can the national recovery and resilience plans. And so I sent in the beginning of my intervention something in the chat, which is a summary of some of the things that we did on my homepage. It's very technical. It's not as beautiful as Francesco's report. It's quite rather detailed. And what we did then is we started bombarding the Commission with like public letters on the worst projects that we could find in the recovery and resilience plans of the member states. And we focused, obviously, since I sit with the Greens, very much also on green aspects of like where things were tagged as green spending, but according to the methodology that I said earlier, we negotiated into the recovery and resilience facility, were not to be seen as green at all. And so there was quite a lot of pressure that we built. I think we were able to pick some of the worst projects out, or at least ensure that decent milestones and targets are set behind projects which were quite uncertain at that time. And I'm very happy that, like, with the help of a lot of people, we were able to actually get there. Let me now say a couple of things about the plans themselves and the issues that I think you're actually interested in. So I'll say a couple of words, and then let's go maybe to talk about implementation, which is a bit of a different step. But I mean, what did we see in these plans? I love that you take the German and the Italian example, because for me, the German example and the Italian actually show what this tool was supposed to be and what the Germans made out of it. Yeah? So let's start with Germany. I mean, as you said, the idea of additionality, I would call it a stimulus, is that you basically put new money on the table, fresh money out there to stimulate an economy which is currently not very well. That's the idea. What the Germans did is, the German government did, is they basically took a program which they had already launched in 2020, repackaged it, parts of it, so that it would fit the requirements set out in the RRF regulation, and submitted this for funding to the Commission. And what the net effect of such an endeavor is that you basically just transfer German taxpayers' debt or German debt to the European level and make it European debt, but you completely take away the additional stimulus effect or the additionality that you were talking about, basically rendering the program useless for Germany in that sense. So the net effect is really quite negative of, like, spending this money on German programs which were already planned. So, and I think people don't really talk about this enough. I mean, in Germany, there's always the debate about, German taxpayers' money being lost. Here we have an effect where basically German taxpayers or German taxpayers are transferring their debt to European taxpayers, especially once we get new own resources like a carbon border adjustment tax or other taxes that we're currently thinking about, plastic tax or whatever, that would then be basically paid by all European citizens. So that's the one side. And then you look into the content of what the German plan puts forward, and you put in your, if I saw on the slide correctly, electric cars, but it's not electric cars, it's hybrid cars. Hybrid was not in our original list as being, a green spending, but they classified it with 40% green spending share, which is absolute, sorry for this quite hard wording, bullshit, because we know that hybrid cars were bad transition technology 10 years ago, but by now are really just like the cars that the German manufacturers can't sell anymore. So to actually support this kind of spending goes against the whole spirit of and letter of the regulation, because it's supposed to have a long-lasting effect. It should not be consumption but investment, and that is being furthered by this. And the fact is that if you drive a hybrid car, you drive maybe 5 minutes with the electric engine, and the rest of the time you have double the emission, because it's mostly these huge Audis and BMWs that really are not the most emission efficient cars that are out there. So to classify this as green spending is also quite daring, if I can say that, from the German government. Yeah. On the reform side, and I mean, just to open a bracket, we very much also thought that it makes sense to combine investments and reform, and that this was actually kind of a smart move from the Commission. And the Germans were amongst the ones who always said, no money without reforms. We need reforms. If you don't do reforms, you shouldn't get any money, blah, blah. And then you look into the German plan and you see there's no reforms. And that they actually classify a pension reform, or like they classify a measure as a pension reform, which is an absolute joke. The pension reform that is in the German plan is a transparency homepage where you can basically type your age, I think, and what you work, and it tells you what kind of retirement benefits you can potentially get. That is not a reform. And to actually classify this as a reform is, again, really a blatant kind of misrepresentation of what this should be about. I mean, we know that the Italian government fell over some of these discussions. We know that the Spanish and the Spanish Social Democratic and Podemos left government coalition almost fell because they were, really forced by the Commission to actually look into their pension schemes. And the country that has been screaming the loudest about reforms didn't implement a single of the country-specific recommendations to an extent, or like not a single, but at least not to a significant subset, as it says in the regulation. So this is, again, really a huge issue that we see, and that somehow evaded the general public. And I think that's why it's so interesting to look into what kind of country-specific recommendations did the different countries get, and did we actually see them fulfilled in the national recovery and resilience plans. So this on Germany. I mean, on the Italian plan, I think what we can see is that there are a lot of positive elements in there. Similar to the Portuguese plans, there is the idea of ensuring that we have private homeowners renovations that actually make houses more energy efficient. That's the eco bonus in Italy, but similar projects also in Portugal. And here's where we just really need to look into how this is transposed into national law. Because I mean, in our methodology, we ask in this specific context, for example, that only renovations that reduce primary energy usage by 40% can be classified as green spending. And so this is, I think, something to keep in mind when we now look at the next phase. And with this, I would come to where we are now. I mean, let's, bracket Hungary and Poland for a second, and let's bracket Bulgaria and the Netherlands for a second, which, I mean, the first two have other issues, and the latter two have just no governments yet, which were able to actually submit these plans. But all of the other countries are now in a phase of where the plans are approved and where we deal with that kind of reality. And now we have to see what happens next. And what happens next in the setup of the recovery and resilience facility is obviously that countries now can ask for half-yearly payments. And here is where we currently, from the office side, but also with the group, we try to focus our energy. Because, I mean, you can say that you spend 37% on green projects. You can even write it in your plan. But at some point, this needs to also become a reality, because in the end, we want to judge, whether at the end of the whole time, actually 37% of the money actually went into green spending, or whether it was just in an approved some paper that actually said there's 37% on that. So what we are currently doing is we're looking at the different milestones for the most important projects, like the eco-bonus, and we try to understand how this money is actually reaching homeowners and how there's actually auditing going on to ensure that this money was spent on making a green renovation a reality. And the complexities in this process are immense. And I mean, we know that the Commission basically just wants to focus on auditing the auditors of the member state. But I think this is a bit insufficient. And here there comes another complexity. The Commission just went to the markets a couple of days ago, saying, I think maybe a week ago, asking, basically selling green bonds. Yeah? So they said, hey, dear investor, here, buy this bond. It will be, your money will be spent on green spending. But there's no additional auditing capacity in place apart from what is already in the RRF. So basically, the Commission goes to the market, says, like, buy these green bonds, and we will take the money to invest them in the green projects in the different member states. But in this audit trail that needs to make sure that the money is actually spent, there are a lot of gaps. And I think, I mean, one thing is to not implement the regulation in the correct way. The other thing is to actually promise the open markets that you would ensure that their money is going into green spending. And I think for both, it is extremely important that we make sure that we actually create this link between the actual projects on the ground with a lot of sample auditings, a lot of, you know, Olaf in there, a lot of EPLO, whatever, whoever is needed, a lot of civil society, a lot of CEPS, you know, like whoever is needed to look into these different projects and to ensure and scrutinize the Commission so that the Commission does its job and actually scrutinizes, maybe with additional capacity, the member states in their spending. So this is what we will focus on, and where we also heavily rely on your support. We will also ask the Commission to publish all operational arrangements as they're currently being hedged out with the member states, because there will be a lot of detail about how, you know, milestone achieving is done. And in the end, it's really about the Commission using this money to also withhold it to create pressure. So if we see that certain milestones and targets are not achieved, which are very important for us, be they on the reform side or be they on the green spending or other side, we need to make sure that the Commission uses its power, its leverage, and says, okay, then you're not getting the funds, yeah? And you're not getting a huge amount of the funds because you haven't been achieving these milestones. And I think this needs to be there. As concluding word, and sorry for talking so long, is the point on where does this all lead and why are we so watchdoggy, if I can say that. Yeah? It goes back to my original motivation of joining this house and this parliament, which is I care about a functioning European system, and in this case, a functioning European fiscal architecture that is able to react to crisis in a way and is also able to ensure the necessary reforms are actually taking place. And that means that we need to actually make this program, the RRF, a success, so that later on this can be a blueprint for how we can potentially get one step closer to a European fiscal architecture. As you know, the stability criteria as well as the European semester being reviewed these very, you know, moments and months. And this goes hand in hand with understanding what we can learn from the RRF. And I think this can be a huge step towards you know, a functioning fiscal and monetary union. But we just need to make sure that we don't do the big mistakes which might happen and which we should be very much aware of.
Oh, thank you, Damian. Actually, I was looking at your site, very nice. So you have the site on the chat, so you can look at it.
You have to find the link with the Excel. That's where it gets interesting. If you scroll down, it says like here to our analysis. That's where it gets interesting.
I haven't opened it yet. I know it's there. But in any case, thank you for this roundup. It's very nice to hear how things went, what was going on with the parliament, because everything moved, a lot of things moved very fast, and also it's very unclear for most people who is doing what and what's going on in different parts. So it was great to listen to you. I learned a lot. I think other people are learning a lot. We have here some questions that were put to us. Yes, one. Let's see. One of them was. I would just go with one that comes closer to you very quickly before we lose it in other more general parts. One of them is that is speaking specifically of the German plan, and speaking about the national perspective of it, and the how were the federal states treated? Were the lender kept out? I think there's a problem in most of the programs that they were written in such a way, with a certain way, such pressure that the consultation part and so on was actually even unrealistic to ask for it, but even when it was realistic, maybe it wasn't done. So I don't know what your opinion is about that. I think it's important. So
yeah, I mean, look, I learned a lot also in this setup of this law, you know, when we negotiated and what we hoped in the beginning when we wrote things into the RF regulation and what we got in the end. Yeah, I mean, I thought that if you write somewhere that all the regions and all the civil society have been or have to be consulted, that this would actually happen. What we see if we look across the different member states, and in this case also Germany, is that these consultations can be meaningful or they can be useless. And meaningful consultation means you actually listen to what the different people and stakeholders have to tell you, and not meaningful consultation means you give them an email address and send your ideas here, and then there's no actual follow-up, no actual binding kind of input. You don't have to react to what's coming in, or you don't consult at all, as also some member states, I believe at least, didn't. So if I could write it again, I would try to have a more binding mechanism that has to have that in place. I mean, you have to, in your National Recovery and Resilience Plan, show how you consulted. There's a chapter on that in each plan, but it's definitely not sufficient to make sure that it actually happens. Yeah, so this is basically missing. But I mean, it goes actually a bit beyond the consultation of stakeholders or regions. I think very often also national parliaments were not really consulted, and this is quite bad, because if you think about it, we as European Parliament didn't get a say on the national recovery and resilience plans, but also national parliaments didn't get a say. That means the executives of both the European level and then obviously much more powerful in many cases at the national level were deciding where this money is flowing, but it's a lot of cash. Like, it's a lot of money that is just being decided by the executive without having an actual backing of the democratically elected, representatives. And I mean, this is just for me a bit of a weird understanding of the distribution of powers in our houses. I mean, Parliament, as I said, has the prerogative of being the budgetary authority in Europe together with the Council, but in many member states, the exclusive budgetary authority. So to just sideline that and say, yeah, it's just EU money, like we can spend it as we like, I think is not very positive.
Thank you. Actually, it just makes me think something that we were discussing here with Francesco the other day, is that I have to say, it's very hard for us sometimes judge the plans. Because one thing we saw is that we had some misgivings about the Spanish plan. Spain is a difficult coalition, so the plan suffers from different positions and some kind of internal stuff. But it was presented to the Parliament, for example, and actually everything was published in great detail. It's a very detailed, enormous amount of, I mean, it was horrible for us, of course, you have all of these hundreds of tables. But from the other side, other programs look much better. But then in reality, at the end, I said, yeah, but they're 1,000 pages shorter, and they're not. And so it was very difficult for us. I don't know if you had the same problem. Did you see anything else that we are seeing? Because with this kind of different level of detail, some program may look very good, but actually doesn't say much. Others look worse because they actually tell you all the details, which if you were putting together, it would look much better if they were a bit vaguer on this stuff. So I don't know how you have, if you face this problem.
I mean, for sure. I think for us, the issue is that basically when the plans were published, there was not much we could change. I mean, we built a lot of pressure on the Commission on actually then ensuring that the worst projects fall out, and that helped. I mean, that did happen, and we also tried to ensure, as I said, that some milestones and targets are defined in a way that they, reduce the worst effects to an extent at least. But if you look at how the national plans are assessed, they all have the same rating.
It's,
I mean, that's weird, you know, just to say the least. You know, that's a bit like, okay, I shouldn't in the public make comparisons, but I mean, you know, voting systems which are controlled are always not the best sign. And I mean, this is kind of a similar thing. You know, if everybody has the same result, I tend to, you know, not trust the judge or whoever counted. You know, like that's. I mean, it's a bit of an issue, and I think what is underlying this is that the real changes were done behind closed doors between Commission and individual member states. And on some member states, the Commission had a lot of leeway and was able to put a lot of stuff in. And that's, I think, to be honest, the Spanish plan is of high quality. Yeah? I mean, there's definitely on paper a lot of positive elements in there. Whereas in other member states, and I gave the example of Germany, they were not able to change a iota of what's in there. And I don't think that this is good for the European Union. And I don't think that this is, you know, how Germany should play its power role, saying like, look, we are fine anyways. We could have gone through this crisis alone without your help. So like, leave us alone with the recovery fund. This is a misunderstanding of the German dependence on European markets. And it's also like a misunderstanding of the Commission's role as not being the Secretariat of the Council of specific member states, but actually being a neutral enforcer of European rule on or regulation on each member state. So this is, I think, for me, the bigger problem. When I looked at the different qualities of the member states' plans, I mean, we scanned for the worst projects, and they were existent in all plans to a certain extent, no matter whether they were short or long, I would say.
Thank you. Yes, this is true. That's a real issue. Now, what I see from the questions here, there are several. I will ask you both. I mean, I think, Damian, you're the one people are going to jump on this because, I mean, this is also, we have here Daniel Tarsis, and we have another person speaking about, that's Giuseppe Diana. They are both having a question is, you know, eligibility criteria or actually additionality. And then on top of it, there is a third one that is, I think, related. Because speaking, what about, are they have to be compliant to a taxonomy that doesn't yet exist, or is there? How do you link the two? Is there a link? So it's a question. In reality, it's at the end, countries have put their national priorities in it. So, I mean, we know that everything that was in the original Next Generation EU that was supposed to be EU level kind of instruments were all practically deleted and transformed to loans to member states. If one looks the original, were a lot of grants around that were European, let's say, or European infrastructure things, European corridors, European things. They all practically disappeared once the council finished, you know, debating. And what came out is grants for member states, loans for member states, and a little bit European. So one of the issues is that member states have practically a total national power over these strategies. And then the question that I see here is, one is everything that is like European rule, like additionality. Does Germany comply with the eligibility and additionality? And in the end, what is with taxonomy? So I think that you're very much involved in this, Damian. So I think it's more for you on this part. Then, yeah. I
mean, as you wish. I can start, Francesco, if you want, and then you can, yeah. Okay, so I think there were a couple of questions in this, yeah? And the first one is on the taxonomy. Obviously, we wanted the taxonomy regulation to be at the basis to define what's green and what's not, very simply put, and also to define what the do no significant harm principle actually means. But the issue with the taxonomy regulation is, while the taxonomy regulation itself was published, the actual content of, you know, what defines what's green or not are the delegated acts. And of those, only 2 had been published at the time, but had not been law. So there was the Climate Mitigation and Climate Adaptation Delegated Act. And so we could not, in a law that was supposed to be closed, the RRF, refer to a law that was not closed yet. So that is legally impossible And so what we had to do is to somehow work with what's already there or create something new within our RRF regulation. So we did a mix of the three things. What we basically did is we took what was already there, which is the so-called RIO marker methodology, like a list of intervention fields to define what's green or not. And we took the taxonomy regulation that was not yet a law, and we merged them as much as we could. We basically updated the RIO marker methodology with taxonomy knowledge, know-how, if you want. And this is then like what came out was a new methodology, if you want. You can call it the improved RIO markers, or you can call it the married taxonomy RIO marker, whatever. I haven't found a good name yet. And we put this as an annex to the regulation itself. So basically, what now defines what's green or not for the RRF, you can find in the regulation as an annex. And what's interesting and not known at all, and I'm still amazed by this, is that first the Commission was opposed to this because they said, look, in all other our EU funds, we already use the RIO markers. We don't want to use two methodologies. And so we said, but look, you can't use a super old methodology and say you build, you have the new Green Deal, new European Green Deal or whatever, but fall back on a methodology that would have allowed you to build harbors and tell them and say, or ports, and say this is a green investment. That's not what we do anymore. You have to update this. And then we convinced the Commission and the member states to use this new methodology. And what's really fun and nobody knows is that a week later or 2 weeks later, there were discussions about the Common Provisions Regulation. And for those who don't know what this is basically the mother regulation over all cohesion funds, another third of EU funds. And so what the Commission then did is said, like, okay, look, if we now using for the RRF this new methodology, we don't want to use a different methodology for the cohesion funds. And they just proposed this on the technical level to be also the methodology for all cohesion green spending. So by that, we not only changed, what is green spending under the RRF, but we also changed for all cohesion funds. So another third of, EU money and the share of that flows to green projects. Again, we changed that. So I think we did the maximum of what was possible at that time, given that the taxonomy regulation was not yet there. So I think you asked some other questions. What was the second question you asked? Sorry, Jorge.
Oh, that's one we are looking at, and even Francesco will give a first answer. Now it's about additionality, really, because we were presenting
super quickly. I mean, the one thing that was negotiated is that all investment projects after I think the 1st of February 2020 are eligible for funding through the RRF. So it was a bit retrospectively. And so the German plan, yes, it adheres to the rules, but it does not adhere to the idea or spirit of the regulation.
Yeah, well, that's the spirit. Yes, that's the point.
Maybe I follow up on what Damian has said. First, apologize if I were a little bit quick in going through the slides, but I didn't want actually to cut too much time to Damian's perspective, which is actually what was very interesting to listen to. I will focus a little bit on additionality because I think is one of the headache of Jorge and myself over the past months, how to measure additionality and how to deal with additionality. In the end, we came with a sort of let's say two steps approach. We try to look at the forest at the same time looking at the trees. So we try to look at the overall, let's say, forecast on public investments over the next years. And that's what is more or less behind that figure that we showed to you. So what were the planned public investments in member states before COVID-19, so in 2019, and what are the new public investment forecast, both based on national plans and on Commission forecast. And there we try to see whether there was actually a relationship between the size of the grants on the one hand and the increase in the public investments. And that was actually merged as a first, picture of the forest, it was that there was no significant correlation. So actually member states behave differently. And so what we tried to do was to look at the trees. So look at the single projects, which is not an easy task if you have a plan like the Italian one with hundreds of projects. And not always, as Jorge said, the plans provide enough details to be able to assess the additionality. So we started a bit with the definition of what is not additional. So, and what is not additional is what we call the substitution effect, that might be related either to the fact that the money are used to, to pay for projects that were already budgeted, and that is the trick that also Damian highlighted. So, all the projects can act eligible are from the past year. So, there's this retro perspective that allows you, to play a little bit. And the other, let's say, definition of substitution effect is with respect to the RRF, and the way the RRF substitute the MFF. Sorry. So the fact that projects were already under the RRF, the MFF are now paid through the RRF. Or this was a topic that Jorge and I were discussing yesterday, the role of reactive, but that's another issue. So in this respect, and we are still ongoing with this exercise, we tried, to give an idea at least of whether there is additionality. And the example of Italy and Germany, where actually what emerges from the forest, let's say, perspective on the next year's forecast on public investment and the trees view. So looking at the actual project that they included, they match pretty well. And so that's where we can have kind of a little bit of more of a strong statement in saying, okay, these are really pursuing two different strategies. And which one is really going in the direction of the, let's say, the heart of the idea of how the RRF should have worked. So that's a little bit the kind of exercise that we did. And maybe I just answered to one of the questions about the pie cake that emerged, that was posed in the chat. We very do not like that pie cake, but we use the pie cake to say, okay, but this labeling exercise is really meaningless if you do not look at the investments that are really behind what we call green transition or sustainable mobility, because I think Damian's point was very, very good in that, in trying to understand, okay, but what's really behind what you call green or sustainable mobility. And that's why, okay, we started from the pie just to, the classification, just we took it from member states. And you see, obviously, in the end, every member state has its own 40% of green and is 20% of digital. But okay, but what's behind this label is what we are interested in. Yeah, so I hope I answered a little bit to explain a little bit better what's the idea behind additionality. But yeah, that's a painful job, actually. It was not easy.
Yes, I don't know if you want to add something, Damian. Otherwise, we go to other questions now. I mean, yeah, additionality is super difficult because and it will become a little bit more difficult as I expect that the MFF is late. So at the end, there will be an issue about are we going to shift unspent commitments into the future? Will the countries manage to add both funds? There will be a lot of stuff there. If you speak about additionality in that sense, it's not only about new projects, but what is going to be the final pie? Is RRF going to substitute the more complex and more difficult implementation of the MFF? This will be, I think we'll be having another seminar, I'm sure, in a year or two, with everybody desperate, seeing delays in the MFF and that the overall pie is not the same as it looked at the beginning.
Can I add one element
yes,
to this, which is, I mean, I think the question of long-term perspective, yeah, that somehow comes out of all of this. And there are a couple of thoughts and that really annoy me when I look at the different plans as well. And one is really what I said earlier, also the difference between short-term consumption support and stimulation and longer-term competitiveness building and investment in really some crucial strategic areas where we still need an investment. And I'll tell you one that sounds extremely boring, which is administrative resilience. You know, we have been trying to fight for this to be one of the core priorities in the recovery and resilience facility, which is supposed to be building resilience. And what we realized is that under a shock like the health care shock that we had or have with the pandemic, our systems and administrations were not resilient. And this is, I mean, true definitely for Berlin, my administration, which I know the best, but it's also true for many other aspects. And sadly, we have seen the same in Germany now again, when we had a flood, which, destroyed, I mean, also in Belgium and I think in the Netherlands as well, parts of like the cities in an area where my family comes from quite significantly, like a whole valley basically. And our systems are not ready. You know, and I think what we have to understand is that crises or shocks, I would rather like to call them shocks because they shouldn't always turn into a crisis, need more resilient systems also from the public administration side. And that means more digitization, that means maybe additional capacities in our healthcare system, that additional capacities in our schooling system. So I think the state itself, the governments itself, they need to really focus on building more resilient structures. That's the first part. And the second part that has also got to do with long-term, I wouldn't call it resilience, but competitiveness, is the question of where is this money actually going that we're spending? Who is benefiting? And this is especially true if you look at the digitization bucket, 20% going. I mean, I think we can calculate again under current prices or past prices, but it's around 130 billion, I think, if you look at the 2019 prices. That's a lot of money. And I mean, if you are digitizing as a state, very often this money is then spent on the biggest bidder and is going to larger companies. And the question of who's actually, in some sort benefiting from these government funds, is it only the big ones, or are we actually giving a chance to startups and SMEs to be part of this digitalization wave so that they can actually build the capabilities to be internationally and also on the European level in different countries competitive? Because we need competitive companies, and I think it's absolutely crucial that we don't just pamper somehow the biggest that are already out there, like our telecoms of past state monopolies that somehow have the best connections to the governments and maybe also are a more reliable big partner to a certain extent and would win a lot of the public procurement calls. And whereas we should actually ensure that maybe 20% goes to new and smaller businesses and to an extent, so that we don't only build back or like do some digitization efforts, but actually build up a new industry. I give you one more data point which shocked me. I saw a tweet recently by our former or current still acting German Minister of the Economy, Mr. Altmaier, who said, like, I meet once a year with our unicorn companies in Germany. And I think it was supposed to be saying, like, look, I'm actually in touch with, the future industries. And I found it horrific. I mean, how often do you meet with the car manufacturers in Germany? But the unicorns of the young startups, these are the employers of the future. And if you don't try to build somehow like an ecosystem for the employers of the future, you will just build, and channel money into the past. And that cannot be what we want to do. I'm not saying we should defund or like not, spend money on any old companies, but I'm just saying that we should also think in perspectively of how can we build new industries? How can we as a state, if we have that much money to give, make everyone partake in this in a fair and open kind of way that maybe if it has to benefit anyone, benefits the small and innovative.
Thank you. Yeah, these are very interesting points. I see here that we actually are having we have still some time, but I see that the questions are very good. I was trying if there's something that doesn't repeat. It doesn't repeat so much, unfortunately. Let's go one here from, this is Dimitri from Brussels. That is, he says, well, that the old plans seems to be very ultra positive, is what he's saying about the future. And doing correct things, and given that the Commission is saying that everybody is AAA, which is have to say I was an evaluator on, strangely enough, they never gave AAA for regional planning and national plans regionally, but this one, they all get AAA. They don't have so many letters to put A, B, C, so they are mostly A. But the question really is that at the moment in the medium term, we see some problems happening. We have some impacts appearing that are starting to show up. And the question is, what is the chance really that the plans do have, let's say, a real growth and recovery effect? I would say even the resilience effect. But one question I would say, in fact, is it was supposed to be a reaction to the pandemic. I'm starting to see it's a reaction to many things, but we don't know exactly what we are reacting to. What is the chance that that we get back maybe what is called as this multiplier effect that is bigger than one, that you actually invest, do all of this, and you generate more value than it was put in? How do we ensure this? Because there is a question here is
sure.
Some people are wondering.
Francesco, do you want to go or should I?
I don't know.
Okay. Okay.
You can go, and I will pick up the one on timing of the monitoring timeline, etc.
Perfect. Okay. I mean, like, this is the $1 million question, like, is this actually useful or not?
Yeah.
So I think the first question is, was this a Corona bridging instrument, or is this a rebuilding the economy instrument, and trying to get us out of a longer, lower level of economic potential? And obviously it's the second. Yeah, it's not a bridge. And there was some misunderstanding, I think, in the beginning about why are we investing so late? Like, why is this not happening faster and so on? This is not like a project like a program like SURE, which tries to bridge the crisis, or liquidity instrument. So this is an instrument to create fiscal space and to foster fiscal investment basically, to ensure that not only the richest countries get out of this crisis stronger, but everyone. And I think in that it will and has already achieved some of its effects. Yeah, in the countries where pre-financing has gone, and it will also, when these disbursements come out, happen. And this also creates some business certainty and so on. There are a lot of positive effects that we can already see that are happening. So, I mean, I'm obviously focused on trying to find the negative sides, because that's my job of trying to, do parliamentary scrutiny. That's also CEPS' job, I guess, of trying to do, NGO commission scrutiny or think tank scrutiny, and that makes sense. Yeah, but there are, I mean, as I said at the beginning, this instrument is cool. It's cool that we, take up debt on the European level together, whereas Chancellor Merkel, I think, only 1.5 years ago said only over my dead body. We have Eurobonds to a certain. I mean, this is cool. We're doing exactly economically the right thing right now, and this is very positive. And now we have to just make sure, and that's why we are all scrutinizing so hard to answer exactly this question: is this money spent usefully with a multiplier effect that is actually worth looking at? And this is also something where we will have to have economists and think tanks really look into, then ex post and analyze and learn from. Or is this just spent on some I don't know, some form of useless investments? And that's the purely economic view. And then you can add all this question of future industry that it was adding to it, to the purely economic view. And then there's the question of, okay, but if we build back, can we build back better? And that's the whole question of green investment, and like trying to say, like, look, let's not just rebuild the industries that potentially suffer the most, but like, let's maybe focus and prioritize on those elements of these industries that are actually trying to fight climate change. And so, that's all useful. And we have to, since we have all these European goals now, we have to then measure very clearly, are we actually achieving these goals according to what our ambition was? And here we have another issue, because, just now the delegated acts on the reporting basically were presented by the Commission and are going to go through. And here we're not very happy, because the reporting basically means that the member states exactly tell us a bit on how are they faring against the goals that we set out. And we saw that sadly it's quite a superficial reporting that we see. A lot of output indicators without relational context. So it's very hard to actually say what that means, that these numbers mean, and so on. And so we have to still do a lot of work on our own. But yeah, we will definitely scrutinize it. I'm sure that there will be a positive effect, but I'm sure that we will see a lot of potential for improvement when it comes to both the purely economic multiplier and a future industry question and strategic investment question, and also when it comes to green spending and the do no significant harm.
Yeah, well, on the first $1 million question about what's the function of the RRF, I think, yes, indeed, there has been some misunderstanding between whether there was a shock absorption capacity or it was like an investment stabilization function. And the way it has been designed is the fact of the same, very similar to Juncker proposal of 2018 of the investment stabilization function. So it came back a little bit, but it's not at all obviously a shock absorber, a structural reform support program with some money attached, which is a big news, as Damian said, and on this I fully agree. I'll try to answer to a couple of questions that were in the chat. The first one, how we did the figure on the timeline. So in that case, we just use the Commission staff working document to construct that figure, and we look at the final timeline for completion of the investment and the reforms. But we have also provided in our analysis also information on the intermediate step. So because obviously what you see from the figure is when the project is completed. So when Italy will build the high-speed railway from Brescia to Venezia. But then obviously there will be intermediate step, and this will be monitored. With respect to the information on the spending under RRF and the breakdown by years, these member states had to provide them in their stability program of 2021, which doesn't mean that all of them did it, but most of them did it. So this allowed us to understand a little bit better when actually the money will be spent, because obviously investment project will be completed by 2026, which doesn't mean that Italy will start receiving money in 2026. Italy will start spending the money a little bit earlier, not as early as Germany, but this is again related to the fact that you spend money when you have the project. So you have committed to some project, and obviously the fact that Germany committed projects that were already planned in 2020, 2021, then facilitates, also the speed of the spending in Germany compared to Italy. I'm just going to add a comment on the monitoring, because this emerged somehow, and Damian stressed it very well, because it also involves, okay, who are the actors that are finally involved in these RRF plans, and in this sense, I pick up the question by Waltraud Schelkle. So what we notice in the steering part, so in the drafting of the plans, is that actually Ministry of Finance were the pen holder with the Cabina di Regia, or the cabinet of the Prime Minister, together with few ministries, while there was not much of involvement, neither of national parliaments, nor social partners, nor regional actors. And this, I see that there are also in this among the participants representatives of the regions, and actually there was we had the meeting last week, and there was unanimous complaining about the fact there was no involvement in the steering, so in the drafting of these plans. So now the question is, okay, what will happen when we will have to we go to the monitoring? Because then in the implementation, yes, the projects are decided centralized at the Minister of Finance, Prime Minister office, but then they will be implemented by regions or at the municipality level. And this is a little bit where I think most of the work will be have to be done, because we do not have now the capacity to see and to say, okay, how will the investments be monitored? How will be the reforms be monitored? Who will be the actors actually in charge of this monitoring? And Damian was absolutely right that when we saw the drafts of the delegated acts, for instance, on the social expenditure, what we noticed as well, that there was kind of very bilateral relationship and much of relying on the national reporting. And when it comes to national reporting, is again the Ministry of Finance or the Prime Minister office. So in that sense, these requirements, this is my personal view, but obviously are a little bit loose, which also, I mean, depends on the fact that it is difficult to monitor implementation of reforms, because, you know, it's not something that you can quantify with indicators, but you have, you know, to go and to see the governance of the, in terms of the implementation of specific reforms. So I think there, in the monitoring phase, the involvement of multi-level actors, I would say, and horizontal involvement of social partners as well will be key in order to understand where actually the investment projects and the reforms will be implemented. Then, I mean, I leave to Damian to answer on the role of the EP in monitoring, but I think he answered pretty broadly before, but if he wants to add an additional
no, I can.
point
I mean, we obviously have you know, the role to scrutinize the Commission and hold the executive accountable in general, but we have almost no additional powers when it comes to the RRF, which is the actual issue at hand. I mean, also the question of why is the Commission not strong versus individual member states, because in the end, the member states know as well as von der Leyen that this is her baby, and that she will not let this fail. I mean, that's absolutely clear. And so if she had a parliament, a European Parliament behind her, where she could always say, watch out, your plan would not go through Parliament if you don't adhere to the different rules and regulations in the, you know, that were set out in the RRF regulation, then the dynamics would have been completely different. Then she would have been a broker between, you know, Parliament trying to focus on ensuring that the rules are adhered to, and the member states trying to get their priorities through. And then it would have been, I think, a much fairer kind of power game. But this is not the case. And so, I mean, what we fought for is that we have bi-monthly structural exchanges with the Commission on all these matters, and can ask basically the Commissioners Dombrovskis and Gentiloni all our questions. We have very often, actually almost weekly until now, sometimes even twice a week, meetings with the recovery task force, if you like, from the Commission. So we do get a lot of exchange, and that's nice. But like, what's obviously missing is hard power to actually enforce certain elements that are of highest importance to us. I think that's absolutely clear.
Okay, now because we have 10 minutes, but I'd like to just go to one part here, because other questions are partially answered or answered to some extent. But one was saying really on the components, there is one is how far research and innovation is in these programs, because it seems that there is no like clear requirements of what to put in there. And then there is the question, has the use component being taken seriously? In other words, was there a consultation? And I don't think we can answer the part of what really happened in consultation. I mean, Germany, you know more about Germany on the innovation. Maybe there is Francesco has actually seen the figures somewhere that he can say it, but maybe if you can start with use, and if you know the figures, but this was the issue about consultation. But how do you see if there is a focus on the, let's say, future generation, or not enough?
I mean, Dragos, Pislavu, and myself really try to push that, you know, a program that is called Next Generation EU should somehow also do something positive for next generation. I think this was also part of the question, and that, I mean, is very true. Like, I mean, this whole thing should be somehow benefiting the future generations. I think when we talk about climate, obviously there are elements of that. And there are other, you know, questions of pension reforms where you could also make a case for future generations to have a potential interest in that. But on the specifics, like, I mean, what we thought that we could potentially fight for in the beginning was also minimum spending share on youth. You know, you basically say not only, hey, you need to do something on youth, but you say, look, you need to spend 5% at least of your National Recovery and Resilience Plan on youth in some aspect. And this didn't make it through the council. I mean, we barely got the 20% in. So the 37% for green, I think it was clear that the commission was fully behind it, and we had some buy-in also from the member states. The 20% from digital, we managed to somehow get this in quite late in the negotiations, but any additional minimum spending share was impossible to somehow get member states to agree. And I think it would have been nice if there was more interest also by the member states to say, like, look, this is something that we need to specifically focus on. And here I can open a little bracket. I think youth is is hit very hard by this pandemic. And I mean, I think we will only understand in a couple of years what the actual emotional and mental effects of this pandemic have been for people who are in the middle of growing up and forming their characters and not being able to see friends and hang out basically only with their parents. I think that, I mean, there are effects of these kind of things. And then you have, in addition, the whole question of what kind of content have you missed out on? And there's a lot of people who didn't have the chance, especially from more challenged backgrounds, to keep up with what was being taught in school digitally. Sometimes in the beginning, not having the devices, and then not having the environment that would actually allow for that. So I mean, there is a huge case to make that we need a lot of spending, especially in education, on also more individualized education, to build back confidence and social skills and mental health that actually works. So I'm quite sad that this is not the biggest focus area of this program, but but we tried.
We're reaching the end. We have 5 minutes. Just, I see one question here. I mean, the others, I'm sorry if we cannot ask everything.
Maybe Francesco wants to answer the other research innovation part, sir.
Yeah, the research innovation, yeah. True. Sorry, Francesco.
No, but we can go through because we try to monitor a little bit, obviously, also research and innovation. So, I mean, I won't go through, but if you see the comparative reports that we prepared, exactly we look at the reforms in research and innovation. So there you can find the answer, because otherwise it would be pretty long. On youth, I mean, it's very difficult to try to understand how to earmark the expenditure for youth people, because if you take social housing for young people, is it like where do we place? Is like it's social housing? Then it's green transition, because obviously in renovation should be under the green, or it's like social cohesion. So it's very difficult to try to disentangle the percentage of the expenditure than it is for youth people. But I fully agree on the points that Damian has raised.
Yes, thanks. Effectively, if you go to the website, by the way, on the countries we have for every country, the countries that we have analyzed, you have pages and pages that you can download where we separate every reform and every expenditure that they have promised, so that you can, in a kind of summary form. This is just in case you want. Now we cannot answer all the questions. There is one that is, I think everybody is probably thinking. There are some countries that haven't submitted their plans. Are they out of business because there was a deadline long ago? What do we do with the countries that haven't submitted anything? I mean, it's surprising that Netherlands has not even sent it.
Yeah, maybe very quickly also, because I have to sadly leave now. I think because I have we
are closing now.
A shadow meeting. But very quickly on this, I mean, look, my issue is not Netherlands and Bulgaria, and these countries will form governments, and then let's see what their plans look like. I know that from our Dutch, I mean, we have MPs in the Dutch Parliament, and they say there's obviously like some preparations ongoing, but a caretaker government cannot make such an important law. So that's why, pitch to the commissioner plan. Yeah? So they will have to look at this in detail when they have a government, but that's not the issue. The bigger issue is obviously what happens with Poland and Hungary. And I think that's maybe just to talk 1 second about Poland. It's quite late in the game to open this topic.
Yeah. No.
But to like maybe just one comment, the issue is that if a country says that they, do not accept the primacy of EU law and say basically like, look, we don't want to remain in this legal order that is the European Union, how can the Commission somehow, accept the national plan and transfer pre-financing of 13% to that member state, and how is that not possible politically, or how is it possible politically, but also technically on on all the rule of law that the European Union is built on. So this is a very complicated situation that we're currently in, that is, I think, quite crucial for the European Union as a whole, and I think we will need to see how this plays out, if that makes sense. I saw there was one last question. Yeah, no, I think that would be all from my side. If you have any other questions to me, you can always write me emails or connect to me on my social media accounts and ask me anything that is interested. I mean, for me, maybe just as a last call, I would be super happy if anyone who's listening and who finds projects that are somehow not working the way they should be, or where the national governments are not potentially following up enough, or where we can see potential scandals, coming up, that to let me know, because I can take this and try to solve it with the Commission, and really build the pressure so that we can build this loop to ensure that in the end the EU money is spent correctly, and that this program is a success, because this could be then the first step towards an actual fiscal architecture on the European level.
This is a perfect way to finish. You just had put the final point of what is coming, what has to be done. So thank you very much for joining us. We knew you were busy. We wondered if you could run from your sessions, I think your Strasbourg staff sessions, I think, or somewhere. You were busy today. So I'm very happy that you appeared on the screen, that we got this discussion. I think this long discussion was brilliant. I think people like this. I think I love to be able that people ask questions and that we actually answer instead of having presentations only. And this was, I think, an example of this brilliant one. So thank you very much for both of you. This was absolutely fantastic. Thank you, Damian, for the details. It was fascinating to hear what you're doing.
Thank you, Francesco, and send your slides, please.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
We will
Take
follow
care.
yours too. Bye to everybody, and thanks for this, for joining.
Bye.